I'm the generation that failed to get an inquiry. And we tried and we tried and we tried. And there are lessons in all of this, that working across parties is sometimes the only way that you can achieve things. And I believe that is one of the strongest lessons that comes from this. Secondly, we should never have accepted blood from countries which we knew were likely to be contaminated. There, the medical profession will have to ask some big questions. I think it was very difficult. It's hard to put yourself in the position of a doctor seeing a haemophiliac child unable to walk because of bleeds in both knees, and they're crying out for a treatment which they know can help. I don't think we did explain enough to patients what was the problems of this illness, and that you might be lucky, but you could be very unlucky. I think the medical profession must ask themselves a lot of questions on all of these issues. It seems to me to be an extremely good report. In my time, the only thing I tried to do was self-sufficiency in British blood for British people, because there was a much better chance of them asking the few questions we had available to us, like, have you ever been yellow? Which is the only way we could try to discover whether somebody had hepatitis. The degree of non-knowledge in those days is amazing, and you must remember it. And you must try in our hearts to put yourself in the position of the parent, even if the doctor has explained fully the facts. Put ourselves in the hands of the doctors, whose culture was not to talk about these things anywhere near as much. The medical profession has changed a lot for the better, but there's still a lot to learn. I've only been able to read parts of the report, but it seems to me that the government has now accepted the absolute obligation to be generous to all those who were affected. And I think back, we had our own little Archer inquiry. We were never brave enough to ask for some of the things that have happened. You've achieved a great deal, and the campaigners and the press. The press has been on the side of this campaign in a way which they were not so keen in times past. Anyhow, congratulations. Well done to all those campaigners. You can't bring back people whose lives have lost or have lived in misery, but you can at least pay very, very generous compensation.
And I now invite Andy Burnham.
Thanks, Caroline. Good afternoon, everybody. There are obviously many people gathered here in London today, but others across the country who will now be struggling to process what has been said today and understand why their own country left them in the wilderness for decades. I think everyone needs to recognise in this place, all politicians need to concede that enough wasn't done quickly enough, and it's taken far too long for this day to come. But this day has, in the end, come down to the efforts of many people in this room. And as Diana said, in 2017, finally I had the evidence that enabled me to say in Parliament that I believed infected blood was an industrial cover-up, a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale. And I believe Sir Brian's report confirms that that is indeed the case. There must be accountability, and there must now be full consideration of prosecutions. And I would include in that the potential for corporate manslaughter charges against Whitehall departments. This report should rock Whitehall to its foundations. This goes to the heart of the way this country has been run. Major questions fall out of it. I believe that we now must see, as a matter of urgency, a full, comprehensive Hillsborough law on the statute book, enacting Sir Brian's recommendation of a statutory duty of candour on senior civil servants. I would go further and say all public servants. They should be required, as part of what they do, The clue's in the name, public servants, to tell the truth at the first time of asking. I think huge questions fall out of this for His Majesty's Treasury. The report is quite clear that it was the fear of financial exposure which led to this culture in Whitehall of never admitting any liability, no language that would suggest it. And in my view, that is what's created this situation, that iron grip that was put onto this issue, completely and utterly wrong. And there must be accountability for that. But there have to be questions asked of Parliament too. How has this injustice stood for this long? I said in the Commons after the second Hillsborough inquest, I asked how could an entire English city have cried injustice for 20 years and nobody was listening? And we could ask that same question for the sub-postmasters and mistresses, couldn't we? How could they have been crying injustice so long and nobody was listening? But we all know in this room that the people infected and affected by the contaminated blood scandal have been banging on the doors of this place for decades. And truthfully, it was only people like Diana and the members of the all-party contaminated blood group who really were listening and in the end have enabled this to happen. But it should not have come about like this. There should have been justice much earlier. And I think it is important for me to say today, in the same way, on the day when we got the Hillsborough verdict, I said the next one should be infected blood. And I made that point at the time. I think it's important for us to say today that after infected blood, it should be our nuclear test veterans, because there is another injustice there. And it's absolutely right that we recognise other people who are still in the wilderness. The campaigners' vindication today should now be used to empower other people still fighting, and I know people in the room will support me when I say that. So huge questions fall out of this. You know, the full apology is only the start. Full compensation comes next. Full accountability, and I believe root and branch reform of Whitehall and of the way this place works as well. The culture is wrong. It needs to change. Sir Brian could not have made it any plainer in what he said today. But I would like to join others in saying we pay tribute to Sir Brian. In the end, he became the most formidable voice for this community. He spoke for all of you. As he said, it is your victory today, although it may not feel like one, but it is. What you have achieved is of monumental significance. And I just would want to say to all of you who I've got to know along the way, you will feel a mix of emotions today. But in the end, you've done it. You've got there. You promised that to your loved ones. You've made it to this point, and we all salute you. Thank you.
And finally, we're going to hear from Glenn Wilkinson, who is Diana's constituent and also the co-founder of the Contaminated Blood Campaign.
Well, what a day. I've been fighting this for about 30 years now, and I know other people have been fighting it longer than me. It feels utterly surreal. I just can't believe we've actually got to this point. The feeling over there in the Civic Hall when Sir Brian started talking was incredible. He received a standing ovation for before he even started speaking. And because he's so humble, he turned around and he said, you should be saluting yourselves, the campaigners that have been involved in this all these decades. And that just shows how humble that man is. At the end, he received another standing ovation. He's just been absolutely incredible. He's vindicated everything I think that long-term campaign has been saying, that this could have been stopped. This didn't have to happen. We didn't have to go through all this. People didn't have to die in their thousands. But that's where we are. And why? Why did it happen? Sir Brian knew. Because the warnings were not heeded. They carried on infecting people. When they were told that the infections were there, they were warned time and time again. But they didn't stop. So people like me, people like Andy, hundreds of other people, thousands of other people were infected with this filth. And we've lost friends and colleagues and campaign members and family members. And you just think, well, all those people should be here with us today. I think we've lost somewhere in the region of 700 people just in the time that it's taken for this campaign to develop. I couldn't be more grateful to my MP, Diana Jones, who I first met in 2010. And she, from the very moment I met with her, has just fought tirelessly on our behalf. And I'd like to thank you publicly, Diana, for everything that you've done for us all. We shouldn't be here. This should have been sorted out decades ago, but here we are. There's never been a more significant and emotional day in the history of our campaign. It's impossible to overstate its importance and what it means to our community. It's desperately sad that justice has failed all those who didn't get to see this day, and the blame for that and many other things lies squarely at the feet of government. From the brief time we've had to read the summary document and having heard Sir Brian Langstaff's speech this afternoon, it seems clear to us that this inquiry's full report won't be anything less than utterly damning on the actions of government, medical professional, and importantly the pharmaceutical companies, because they bear a lot of the responsibility as well. We believe once all the evidence is being gathered and it's put at the feet of government, it's going to rock the foundations of Westminster, and so it should. After 40 years of campaigning and 3,000 deaths and a continuing death toll of 2 per week, our community deserves actions, not words. One thing the government could do immediately is to make further interim compensation payments to those whose lives have been put at risk because of their infections. A comparison can be made between the interim payments made to the post office victims of £450,000 for being given a prison sentence, while the infected blood victims have been given £100,000 for being given a death sentence. Where's the fairness in that? Thank you.
We've got just a short while to have some questions, because I know many people here want to go to the chamber to listen to what the Prime Minister's got to say. So if I can ask you to introduce yourself, put your hand up, and then the people that are responding, I'm going to give you a microphone as well. Can you stand up to give your answers?
Thank you very much, Darren from Sky News. Just to pick up, Andy, on what you were saying about the civil service in all of this. There's been an awful lot of focus on lots of other groups, but maybe not so much on the civil service. Lord Owen, first of all, I think you've talked in the past about how you feel officials were frustrating that evidence might have been destroyed. Do you agree with what Andy Burnham says when he talks about this being focused on Whitehall and that things need to change? And then just second of all, to you, Andy, on the kind of wider context of these scandals do seem to keep happening. You know, there's been problems in other countries with inflected blood, but they were dealt with much earlier. Is there something systemic almost within the British state?
Well, I'll just answer one question. I mean, I don't like blaming civil servants. I believe ministers should take responsibility. And in retrospect, I should have banned blood coming into this country from countries which you knew would likely to be contaminated. That was a huge decision, and the medical profession was definitely against it. I was not a minister of health because I was a doctor. I had to take their advice, and their feeling was there was much too much pain and hardship out there for haemophiliacs in particular if you didn't give them the option of this drug, even though it might be contaminated. Now, that was wrong, and I should have overruled it.
I, like Lord Owen, I mean, I don't reach first to blame individuals, and there are many kind of truly decent people working in the civil service, and that needs to be recognised. However, it is the system and the culture that's rotten, and that really does need to change. We've just seen this too often now, haven't we? The same pattern keeps on repeating. So when are we going to break the cycle? Civil servants should be empowered to tell the truth at the first time of asking, because many of them will want to tell the truth
at the first time of asking. But it is that point I made about the grip of the Treasury on the system, that the finances come first. That often is the kind of the mentality, and consequently people come second, third, or not at all. And that, I think, is at the heart of it. My own feeling is, having been in here 16 years and having been a minister, is that there is too much power in the hands of the unelected state. And that creates situations like this. As I say, there's other injustices yet to be uncovered, though, so this isn't, again, on its own. Nuclear test veterans is something that all colleagues in the media, I would ask you all to be looking at it and give it exactly the same treatment. This is something that only, in my view, a comprehensive Hillsborough law can change, and that's what we've put forward. And for me, I think people can see it now. The public can see it because they can see all of these things and they can see the pattern. And I think there's a general sense out there that we do need root and branch reform in our politics and the way the country functions.
Any more questions?
Hi, Eleanor Hayward from The Times. Just wanted to pick up on what you said before about corporate manslaughter charges, particularly towards Whitehall departments potentially. How do you think that would work in practice? Would that be Department of Health? And is that something other people on the panel would support as well?
I mean, obviously, I thought very carefully about before saying that, but I did make that point to the inquiry when I gave evidence as well. And I would just refer you all to paragraph 297 in volume 7, which talks about the extensive nature of the cover-up. It's pretty damning, actually, what it says. And in this context, the cover-up has real implications when people are not aware of the risks and the infections. That has big implications for people's lives. And so I don't think it is overstatement to say that there should be consideration of it. How else do we get the culture change if there's not accountability? There has to be accountability here. You cannot have a report of this enormity and there not be now a kind of a reaction to it that is equal to what is actually said in the report. You cannot have a situation where an official line is held for decades, where lies are put to ministers, and there not be major change that falls out of that. And as I say, that should include consideration of whether there is a case for corporate manslaughter charges.
So is that civil servants facing potential prosecutions?
Well, it would be for the department, wouldn't it? Recognising the scale of what has been done, so that, hence that the corporate responsibility of Whitehall.
I just wanted to say, I mean, there's many horrific accounts within the report. One of them, though, is around Trelaws and what happened to children and experimenting on children. And I think there are some real questions there, because that, to me, is a very clear indication of criminal behaviour, and that's something that I think the police should be investigating. And if there is sufficient evidence, that should be passed to the CPS. So I think there are cases that need to be looked at.
I just wanted to say that I was always puzzled how, when it was many years after the events, the department was still following a line of no fault, when the people responsible had gone years before from their roles and everything else. Why was there such a culture to prevent a proper investigation and an admission that something had gone wrong long after those responsible for the decisions had moved on? You can understand it at the time, people want to avoid responsibility, but years afterwards, I couldn't understand that. And that does go to the culture issues that both Andy and Diana have been speaking about.
Any more questions, Kate?
Thank you very much. Kate McCann from Times Radio. Andy and Glenn, can I ask you both, do you trust the NHS now? I mean, we've talked at length about what's happened in this case, but
we were treated as well. Sir Brian brings to the fore about how the trusts and schemes that were set up to support us have treated us as well. So this is not only a cover-up, it's actually an abuse by many people who were set to supposedly care for us.
Throughout the report, Sir Brian refers to that line, the best treatment possible was given to people. And we now know once and for all that that was a lie. People have been saying that was a lie for many, many years. And now we have the definitive word on that.
We've been gaslit for generations. This report today brings an end to that, and it looks to the future as well, and says that this cannot continue, this ethos of denial and cover-up, and that the duty of care for candour has to be reviewed going forward, so this can never happen again.
And people have lost decades of their life campaigning, and that has added to the trauma. Not only are you dealing with infection, dying, loss of family, loss of years and years of that have been wasted on this campaigning. It should never have happened. It should have been dealt with straight away.
And as I sit here as one of 27,000 blood transfusion victims, that's what echoes in my head. Behind every one of those 27,000 is a family.
Well, the chair of the Infected Blood Inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, spoke to victims and their relatives after delivering his findings. He told them that they had been betrayed and deserved recognition.
For everyone involved, the evidence given to this inquiry has been difficult to listen to. No, that's the wrong word. It's hard for those centrally involved, and it must have been hard for many observing. But it has been much harder still for those who were recounting their own experiences, or listening to stories which touched a nerve, which brought back memories they would rather have forgotten, but which they brought themselves to tell the inquiry because the truth was important to tell. The harm that was done to people cannot adequately be put into words. I've tried. But patients, parents watch their children suffer and in many cases die. This disaster was not an accident. People put their faith in doctors and in the government to keep them safe, and their trust was betrayed. Now is the time, finally, for national recognition of this disaster, for proper compensation, and for vindication for all those who have been so terribly wronged.
Well, our correspondent Alice Porter joins me now. And Alice, this is a huge report, more than 2,500 pages, and so many failings catalogued.
Yeah, it really is, and I think it's a bittersweet day for the victims of this scandal. Finally, the claims that so many of them have made for decades is finally laid bare in black and white in this report. For decades, these victims and their families and campaigners have said that there was a cover-up. They've said that documents were concealed. They said that doctors, ministers, civil servants knew about the risks of these blood products, and yet they continued with treatment, often without patients' consent. So there is a sense that many of them are vindicated, but there's also an unbearable tragedy, really, in this report, that it's so clear reading it of the repeated times in which the government were warned about the risks. Sir Brian Langstaff said we knew about the risks of hepatitis in blood from as far back as World War II. We also heard that in 1974 the WHO warned the UK government about the risks of imported products, and Sir Brian Langstaff said had the British government listened to the WHO, there would have been fewer infections. And it's kind of the timeline continued. In 1982, we became aware of the risk of AIDS being transmitted in blood. And the following year, the government made the decision to continue importing blood products. And that timeline there takes us up till today. And it was, I think, quite moving was when Sir Brian Langstaff said it's a shame this inquiry didn't happen 30 years ago. And I think that's something that's certainly been felt by many of the victims today, that they welcome what Sir Brian Langstaff said. And when he began speaking, he was given an enormous round of applause, and he's really won over a community that have been very badly treated by clinicians, by doctors, by the establishment in many respects. So he's won their trust and provided a report to them that is certainly being welcomed. And it's a report, though, that does come with some very key recommendations for the government. We are expecting the Prime Minister to make some sort of apology in the next hour or so, but Sir Brian Langstaff has said that he wants any apology to be met with action. Key recommendation being for compensation to be paid out as soon as possible and for a scheme to be set up, because somebody dies every 4 days as a result of this scandal. So the compensation is key, but also it's important to stress this is a scandal that is not in our history books. This is a scandal that is very present, and in fact one of his key recommendations was to make sure that anyone who received a blood transfusion before 1996 make sure that they are tested urgently, he said, for hepatitis C. And he's also hoping that we can have memorials across the country to remember those victims that have died in what has been described as the worst treatment disaster in NHS history.
Alice, thank you very much. And as Alice was saying there, we are expecting a statement in the Commons shortly from the Prime Minister. He is expected to issue an apology from the government. The Prime Minister not yet in the chamber, but members of the front bench are gathering, as you can see. We are expecting that any moment now. We'll bring it to you live as it happens, of course. In the meantime, let's bring in our political editor, Beth Rigby. Beth, a momentous day then for victims and victims' families. The Prime Minister will be acutely aware of that. What are we expecting him to say?
That's right, Jonathan. I mean, this really is a momentous moment because this is a report that underlines decades of failure and decades of cover-up. And what it clearly says in the report is that successive governments let down victims and the families of victims. And now, after decades of campaigning, and the thing that struck me from when victims were talking about the ordeal they've been through of gaslighting, decades of gaslighting, finally a Prime Minister will stand up in the Commons and issue an apology. And in the report, Sir Brian says, in general, I can say that responsibility for much lies with successive governments, even though others may share some of it. It will be astonishing to anyone who reads this report that these events could have happened in the UK. It may also be surprising that the question of why so many deaths and infections occurred have not had answers before now. Well, there are answers in this very long, extensive report. And now this moment in the Commons where Rishi Sunak will stand up and make a formal apology, we expect, on behalf of successive governments that so badly let victims down.
We're seeing the Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden sitting down now, so I don't think we are far away, Beth. What was notable in the report published today is that there were no names mentioned, there was no finger-pointing. Where do you think this does go next? Because, yes, they're going to get their apology, yes, they're going to get compensation, but many victims and many victims' families will also want justice, and they'll want individuals to know that they are facing the consequences of what happened.
I think, Jonathan, that this is a process and a reckoning that has been for decades in the making, and today was very much about victims and families being able to have the floor to say what they wanted to say as this damning report came out. And we had a briefing with the Prime Minister's spokesperson this morning, and there were questions around compensation schemes and the timeline and what comes next. And we were repeatedly told in those briefings that today is not the day for those conversations, that today is acknowledging those systematic failures of individuals, of the NHS, of government and the state that were meant to protect people and failed in that, and not only failed in that, but then there was this, to quote Sir Brian, pervasive, subtle, chilling cover-up of what was going on. And this today is an acknowledgement of that. Tomorrow we will get a compensation scheme. Some of the details will come out. There are also questions about whether or not there should be legal proceedings. That has also been raised. So I think that this is the beginning of another process in which all of these questions will be asked and the answers will begin to come out. But today there will be the apology. Then tomorrow we are expecting this compensation scheme to be announced, and there's questions about the timeline for that. When will that come into effect? Notable too, though, that Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader that could well become the Prime Minister later in the year, should Labour win the general election, he also wrote in the Sunday Times yesterday saying it's time for no more warm words, no more false dawns. The time has come for action, and said very clearly that he also supported compensation. So that's what Labour has said, and we're going to hear what the Prime Minister has to say in terms of an apology. I think we'll get a fuller statement from the government tomorrow about the compensation scheme and responding to Sir Brian's report.
Are we expecting to hear anything from the Health Secretary, from the NHS, in light of today?
Well, I think that in a way that the government is responding on behalf of successive governments, and it might be that in the end that the NHS might want to make a statement, but if the Prime Minister's responding in form of the government, I don't think we're going to hear from the Health Secretary. We'll hear from another government minister tomorrow in terms of the compensation scheme. And it would be interesting to see what they say on that. It has been spoken of or expected that up to £10 billion might have to be put aside to compensate people. Remember, 3,000 people lost their lives, 30,000 other
Beth, I'm going
victims.
to interrupt. The Speaker is on his feet and the Prime Minister is in the chamber.
Given the nature of the statement, I've agreed that there will only be a few limited brief responses today, as there will be a further major statement tomorrow when all honourable members will have the opportunity to question the Cabinet Office Minister at length. I now call the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak.
Mr. Speaker, Sir Brian Langstaff has today published the final report of the infected blood inquiry. This is a day of shame for the British state. Today's report shows a decades-long moral failure at the heart of our national life. From the National Health Service to the Civil Service, to ministers in successive governments, at every level, the people and institutions in which we place our trust failed in the most harrowing and devastating way. They failed the victims and their families, and they failed this country. Sir Brian finds a catalogue of systemic, collective and individual failures, each on its own serious and taken together amounting to a calamity. And the result of this inquiry should shake our nation to its core. This should have been avoided. It was known these treatments were contaminated. Warnings were ignored repeatedly. Time and again, people in positions of power and trust had the chance to stop the transmission of those infections. Time and again, they failed to do so. Sir Brian finds an attitude of denial towards the risks of treatment. Worse, to our eternal shame, in a way that it is hard to even comprehend, they allowed victims to become objects for research. Many, including children, at Lord Mayor Treloar's College were part of trials conducted without their or their parents' knowledge or consent. Those with haemophilia or bleeding disorders were infected with HIV, hepatitis C and hepatitis B through NHS treatment, through blood clotting products such as Factor VIII, including those who had been misdiagnosed and did not even require treatment. Many were infected through whole blood transfusions, Others were infected through their partners and loved ones, often after diagnoses had been deliberately withheld for months or even years, meaning these infections should have easily been prevented. I find it almost impossible to comprehend how it must have felt to be told you had been infected through no fault of your own with HIV or hepatitis B or hepatitis C, or to face the grief of losing a child, or to be a young child and lose your mum or dad. Many of those infected went on to develop horrific conditions, including cirrhosis, liver cancer, pneumonia, TB, and AIDS, enduring debilitating treatments like interferon for these illnesses the NHS had given them. Many were treated disdainfully by healthcare professionals who made appalling assumptions about the origin of their infections. Worse still, they were made to think that they were imagining it, made to feel stupid. They felt abandoned by the NHS that had infected them. Those who acquired HIV endured social rejection, vilification, and abuse at a time when society understood so little about the emerging epidemic of AIDS. And with illness came the indignity of financial hardship, including for carers and those widowed and other bereaved family members. And throughout it all, victims and their loved ones have had to fight for justice, fight to be heard, to be believed, fight to uncover the full truth. Some had their medical records withheld or even destroyed, and the inquiry finds that some government papers were destroyed in a deliberate attempt to make the truth more difficult to reveal. Sir Brian explicitly asks the question, was there a cover-up? Let me directly quote his answer for the House. There has been. He continues, not in the sense of a handful of people plotting in an orchestrated conspiracy to mislead, but in a way that was more subtle, more pervasive, and more chilling in its implications. To save face and to save expense, there has been a hiding of much of the truth. Mr. Speaker, more than 3,000 people died without that truth. They died without an apology. They died without knowing how and why this was allowed to happen. And they died without seeing anyone held to account. Today, I want to speak directly to the victims and their families, some of whom are with us in the gallery. I want to make a wholehearted and unequivocal apology for this terrible injustice. First, to apologise for the failure in blood policy and blood products and the devastating and so often fatal impact this had on so many lives, including the impact of treatments that were known or proved to be contaminated, the failure to respond to the risk of imported concentrates, the failure to prioritise self-sufficiency in blood, the failure to introduce screening services sooner, and the mismanagement of the response to the emergence of AIDS and hepatitis viruses amongst infected blood victims. Second, to apologise for the repeated failure of the state and our medical professionals to recognise the harm caused. This includes the failure of previous payment schemes, the inadequate levels of funding made available, and the failure to recognise hepatitis B victims. And third, to apologise for the institutional refusal to face up to these failings, and worse, to deny and even attempt to cover them up. The dismissing of reports and campaigners' detailed representations, the loss and destruction of key documents, including ministerial advice and medical records, and the appalling length of time it took to secure the public inquiry which has delivered the full truth today. Mr. Speaker, layer upon layer of hurt endured across decades. This is an apology from the state to every single person impacted by this scandal. It did not have to be this way. It should never have been this way. And on behalf of this and every government stretching back to the 1970s, I am truly sorry. Mr. Speaker, today is a day for the victims and their families, to hear the full truth acknowledged by all, and, in the full presence of that truth, to remember the many, many lost loved ones. But justice also demands action and accountability. So I make two solemn promises. First, we will pay comprehensive compensation to those infected and those affected by this scandal, accepting the principles recommended by the inquiry, which builds on the work of Sir Robert Francis. Whatever it costs to deliver this scheme, we will pay it. And my right honourable friend, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, will set out the details tomorrow. Second, it is not enough to say sorry, pay long overdue compensation, and then attempt to move on. There can be no moving on from a report that is so devastating in its criticisms. Of course, in some areas, medical practice has long since evolved, and no one is questioning that every day our NHS provides amazing and life-saving care to the British people. But Sir Brian and his team have made wide-ranging recommendations. We will study them in detail before returning to this House with a full response. And we must fundamentally rebalance the system so we finally address this pattern so familiar from other inquiries like Hillsborough, where innocent victims have to fight for decades just to be believed. Mr. Speaker, the whole House will join me in thanking Sir Brian and his team, especially for keeping the infected blood community at the heart of their work. We would not be here today without those who tirelessly fought for justice for so many years. I include journalists and parliamentarians in both houses, especially the Right Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull North. But most of all, the victims and their families, many of whom have dedicated their lives leading charities and campaign groups, pouring their own money into decades of running helplines, archiving, researching, pursuing legal cases, often in the face of appalling prejudice. It is impossible to capture the full pain and injustice they have faced. Their sorrow has been unimaginable. They have watched loved ones die, cared for them as they suffered excruciating treatments or provided their palliative care. Many families were broken up by the strain. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been knocked off course, dreams and potential unfulfilled. But today, their voices have finally been heard. The full truth stands for all to see. And we will work together across government, our health services and civil society to ensure that nothing like this can ever happen in our country again. I commend this statement to the House.
Call Keir Starmer, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This response can only begin in one place, because this is an injustice that has spanned across governments on an unprecedented scale, and collectively we failed to protect some of the most vulnerable in our country. And so, as well as paying tribute to the courage and determination of the victims, the infected and the affected, some of whom are here in the gallery today, I want to acknowledge to every single person who has suffered that in addition to all of the other failings, politics itself failed you. That failure applies to all parties, including my own. There is only one word: sorry. And by that apology, I acknowledge that this suffering was caused by wrongdoing, delay, and systemic failure across the board, compounded by institutional defensiveness. And as Sir Brian Langstaff makes clear in his report, any apology today must be accompanied by action. And so I welcome the Prime Minister's confirmation that compensation will now be paid. And he should be under no doubt whatsoever that we will work with him to get that done swiftly. Because make no mistake, the victims in this scandal have suffered unspeakably. Thousands of people have died. They continue to die every week. Lives completely shattered. Evidence willfully destroyed. Victims marginalised. People watching their loved ones die. Children used as objects of research. On and on it goes. The pain barely conceivable. And so, as well as an apology, I also want to make clear we commit that we will shine a harsh light upon the lessons that must be learned to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. Because, Mr. Speaker, when you pass through the doors of a hospital, it is a moment of profound vulnerability. You entrust your life into the hands of perfect strangers. We go to hospital for care. And that is what many of the people affected find so hard to accept, the betrayal of that trust by people and institutions that were meant to protect them. People like Mark Stewart, my constituent, who was given Factor VIII in the 1980s as part of a clinical trial, as was his father, as was his brother. All three subsequently contracted hepatitis C. But only Mark remains with us today. And then over the decades, as Mark and so many like him searched for truth and justice, the British state ignored them. The truth, as Sir Brian says today, was hidden from them for decades. And that is why this is one of the gravest injustices this country has seen. And yet we have to be honest. This scandal is not unique. And the institutional defensiveness identified by Sir Brian is a pattern of behaviour that we must address. Because, Mr. Speaker, while Mark may never get his brother, his father, or his health back, for all the families affected, we must restore the sense that this is a country that can rectify injustice, particularly when carried out by institutes of the state. That is our job today, this week, and beyond. Frankly, it is the very least that we owe. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for the collegiate tone in which he has responded to today's report and his sincerity. He is right, it is irrefutably clear that an unconscionable injustice has been done, the result of a consistent and systemic failure by the state time and again for decade after decade, and it's why I apologise wholeheartedly and unequivocally to every single person impacted by this scandal. And the anger and sorrow felt across this House is the right response. And it is right that we now act on behalf of the victims, their loved ones, and the whole community who expect us to put right this historic wrong.
Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
The thousands of people at Central Hall thanked Sir Brian Langstaff. He thanked them.
Well, that was a statement from the Prime Minister following the publication of today's report into the blood scandal inquiry. Rishi Sunak said today is a day of shame for the British state. He said the result of this inquiry should shake our nation to the core. Victims were made to think they were stupid. They felt abandoned. He went on to say there was the indignity of financial hardship, and victims and loved ones have had to fight for the truth. The Prime Minister saying more than 3,000 people died without that truth or an apology or anyone held to account. I want to offer a wholehearted and unequivocal apology for the institutional failure, layer upon layer of hurt It did not have to be this way, the Prime Minister said, and on behalf of every government going back to the 70s, I am truly sorry. The Prime Minister also talked about compensation. We will hear more about that tomorrow. He said, whatever it costs, we will pay it. We will look at the report and its findings and address the pattern of innocent victims fighting for decades just to be believed. Let's bring in our political editor, Beth Rigby. And Beth, that was quite the statement, quite the apology.
It really was. And in terms of such a historic day and such a seismic report for the British state, for the NHS, for successive governments, the Prime Minister there issuing a fulsome apology on many different levels. And he promised that there would be comprehensive compensation, as he put it, and this clearly not a moment to play politics at all. Sir Keir Starmer there looking up frequently, actually, to the gallery where many victims and families of victims were looking on at this statement today, said that politics itself has failed you. He said the failure applies to all parties, including my own. There is only one word, sorry. Acknowledging there that this was a failure of successive governments. It was only in 2017, after decades of campaigning, that Theresa May, the then Prime Minister, ordered an inquiry. Victims ignored and, in the words of one today, gaslighted for decades over this scandal, which the Prime Minister there acknowledged had been covered up. He talked about a catalogue of systemic, collective and individual failures, each on its own serious and taken together, amounting to a calamity. And the result of this inquiry should shake our nation to its core. The Prime Minister there pulling out some of the remarks from Sir Brian in his report. As for next steps, both leaders there acknowledging that compensation must be paid. The Prime Minister saying it would be comprehensive. Keir Starmer responding, saying, I welcome the Prime Minister's confirmation that compensation will now be paid, and he should be under no doubt whatsoever that we will work with him to get that done swiftly. None of it can undo, of course, the devastation that has been felt by thousands and thousands of people over this scandal, this infected blood scandal. But at some moment there, it's going some way today, I think, to publicly apologise on both sides of the House and say that compensation will now be delivered after all these years.
It was interesting, Beth, how both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition both hinted at previous scandals, and we can think of many, can't we, over the last 4 decades, from Bloody Sunday to Hillsborough to the current post office scandal, of course, that we hear so much about. And Sir Keir Starmer saying politics itself failed you. There's only one word, sorry. I wonder how parties, Westminster, addresses that, the fact that victims themselves had to fight to be believed.
Yeah, and I think the thing about this scandal is the way in which it cuts across decades, the way in which it cuts across different institutions of the state. So it goes from doctors that we think are meant to keep us safe. It goes to the NHS that's meant to cure us, not deliver us harm. It then goes to government ministers and the actual government and the state itself, all of whom have a duty of care to citizens. So it's a systemic failure on so many different levels.